All right, so this is my official reread of Aristotle's Physics. I've done a couple of videos talking about what my aim is here, and ultimately the aim is to gather in separate videos, but ultimately bringing them together into one, gather the necessary quotes, inputs, thoughts, connections in a more concise, articulate way with this sort of new, broader context that I have around this subject, and then put that together into a draft to be reworked into a final form. As I go through here, I'm going to be doing just the introduction right now, but I haven't mapped this out to ensure that I'm capturing everything, the most critical things. And like I mentioned, I want to have a cohesive narrative and some underpinning threads assigned to it. So I'm really kind of throwing the spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. I'm going to try to capture more than I need to so that I can peel back the unnecessary pieces and tailor that narrative. So with that in mind, let's get into it. Aristotle's Physics, a guided study. Joe Sachs. It's the Masterworks of Discovery, Guided Studies of Great Texts in Science, Rutgers University Press. It begins with this philosophic writing section. The activity we call science is dependent upon and embedded within a prior activity known as philosophy. Any scientific understanding presupposes opinions about the way things are. Those fundamental opinions, which must be the foundations of any science, are the direct topics of reflection in thinking that is philosophic. Philosophy is a permanent human possibility, and it must have arisen in all places and times when anyone paused in the business of life to wonder about things. But it was among the ancient Greeks, that it was named and described and began to be reflected in written texts. It was two thinkers who wrote during the 4th century BC, Plato and Aristotle, who showed the world for all time the clearest examples of philosophic thinking. And so the very first line is ultimately what I need is the highlight to pull out. The activity we call science is dependent upon and embedded within a prior activity known as philosophy. That's a great one-sentence summary of the exact idea that I've expressed, which is that philosophy should be a part of science. And that feeds into this larger argument that I have about all sort of intellectual disciplines. I think I've identified like 7 of them. They're not separate. They are part of the same thing, and they should be seen as different steps along a critical thinking journey. So it may appear that Aristotle rejects this Platonic path. He was talking about, Plato's thinking, giving his thought the closure of answers and doctrine, turning philosophy into science. This is a distortion produced by transmission through a long tradition and by bad translations. The tradition speaks of physics, metaphysics, ethics, and so on as sciences in the sense of conclusions deduced from first principles. But the books written by Aristotle that bear those names contain no such quote-unquote sciences. What they all contain is dialectical reasoning, argument that does not start with the highest knowledge in hand, but goes in quest of it, beginning with whatever opinions seem worthy of examining. Exactly like Plato's dialogues, Aristotle's writings lead the reader on from untested opinions toward more reliable ones. Unlike the author of the dialogues, Aristotle records his best efforts to go beyond trial and error to trustworthy conclusions. What keeps those conclusions from becoming items of dogma? The available translations hide the fact, but Aristotle devises a philosophic vocabulary that is incapable of dogmatic use. And I'm going to pause here and I will continue on. But this is important to note. This is the reason why I'm reading all of this, is because I need to bake this into my argument. And this is a good setup for that. Introducing, kind of the background here and how dogma kind of plays into it. And dogma is going to be a big undercurrent for all of us. This claim will come as a surprise to anyone familiar with the lore of substances and accidents, categories, essences, per se, individuals, and so forth. But if Aristotle were somehow to reappear among us, he would be even more surprised to find such a thicket of impenetrable verbiage attributed to him. Aristotle made his students work hard, but he gave them materials they could work with. Words and phrases taken from the simplest contents of everyday speech, the kind of language that is richest in meaning and most firmly embedded in experience and imagination. And I'm going to pause here really quickly to just say this speaks to one of the reasons why I feel compelled to try to speak to kind of the average person in all of this, because of that exact thing. The materials that Aristotle provides, they're things that you can work with, and he boils them down to their simplest level, and it's a process of starting from a simple form and examining from there, right? And so this is a good intersection of dogma, but also language, and underpinning that sort of tightrope that I have to walk in talking to intellectuals and the average person. So continuing on. The only trouble with ordinary speech for the purposes of philosophy is that it carries too much meaning. We are so accustomed to its use that it automatically carries along all sorts of assumptions about things that we make without being aware of them. Aristotle's genius consists in putting together the most ordinary words in unaccustomed combinations. A way that I might be able to provide some color on that piece right there would be to introduce this idea, which I haven't explored in a little bit, but I can kind of give a high-level account of right now, which is our process of understanding language and sort of the way that we experience the world in general. But the idea is, words, they have meanings, we have definitions, right? We get that. But ultimately, what's happening is words are just sounds that travel throughout space, and they hit our ears. And what it does is it creates this more intuitive reaction. So what happens before you've processed the word is the intuitive understanding of what that word conveys, right? It's more of a feeling first. And so in that sense, right, language and the beauty of what Aristotle has done here, and the reason why this is still valuable, is it eliminates that barrier, because language evolves over time. Translations are hard to keep up with. And so, this totally combats the criticism about the absurdness of Aristotle and sort of this stereotype about philosophy, about making these words so great, weird, nothingness and thinghood or whatever. All of that gets addressed through that concept right there. So come back to that, explore the idea of how language and interpretation affect meaning to us, and how subjective that kind of makes things. Even though we're pretty close in most everyday language, when we're talking about big concepts like this that we're less familiar with, it can radically change the meaning of what's being conveyed. So since the combinations are jarring, our thinking always has to be at work right now, afresh, as we are reading. But since the words combined are so readily understood by everyone, our thinking always has something to work with. The meanings of the words in Aristotle's philosophic vocabulary are so straightforward and inescapable that two results are assured. We will be thinking about something and not stringing together empty formulas, and we will be reliably in communication with Aristotle, thinking about the very things he intended. So that's critical. We need to illustrate both the sort of thing that Aristotle wrote and the way the translations we have destroy its effect. Consider the word essence. It is an English word, and we all know more or less how to use it. Perfumes have an essence. Beef stock can be boiled down to its essence. And the most important part of anything can be called its essence. It seems to have some connection with necessity, since we occasionally dismiss something as not essential. By the testimony of usage, that is just about the whole of the word's meaning. Essence is a relatively vague English word. If we know Latin, the word begins to have some resonance, but none of that has crossed over into English. So what do we do when we find a translation of Aristotle full of the word essence? We have to turn to expert help. Ordinary dictionaries will probably not be sufficient. We will need philosophic dictionaries, commentaries on Aristotle, textbooks on philosophy, or trained lecturers who possess the appropriate degrees. In short, we need to be initiated into a special club. It may make us feel superior to the ordinary run of human beings, and it will at least make us think that philosophy is not for people in general, but only for specialists. Medical doctors, for example, seek just those effects for their area of expert knowledge by never using an ordinary understandable name for anything, but only a Latin derivative with many syllables. But did Aristotle want such a result? If not, writing in such a style can hardly be presented as a translation of Aristotle. What did Aristotle write where the translators put the word essence? In some places he wrote the what something is, or the being of it. In most places he wrote, quote, what something keeps on being in order to be at all, end quote. Or, quote, what it is for something to be, end quote. The phrases bring us to a stop, not because we cannot attach meaning to them, but because it takes some work to get a hold of what they mean. Since Aristotle chose to write this way, is it not reasonable to assume that he would want us to do just that? We recognize this sort of wordplay as a standard device of poetry, which works on us through the ear, the visual imagination, and our feelings. The poet makes us experience a fresh act of imagining and feeling at his direction. Think of all that would be lost if he had written, quote, notwithstanding the fact that an immeasurable acreage of deciduous forest manifests the state of affairs characteristic of its incipitantly dormant condition, end quote. Aristotle's phrases in the present example do something that is exactly analogous to the poet's wordplay, but it is directed only at the intellect and understanding. Other words and phrases of his do carry imaginative content, but are subordinated to the intellect and understanding. So just to recap and to share my thoughts here, right? The idea is, just like the poet, Eminem, right? Just because this is top of mind, I would never use this in the example I'm going to provide, unless I guess maybe for making it accessible to more people. But, he has an interview with, the CNN guy on 60 Minutes. And he says, it really bothers me when people say you can't rhyme anything with orange. And it's just like the way that you elongate syllables or kind of change how you say a word can make it rhyme, right? And so it's this intentional manipulation of wordplay to convey meaning on an intellectual level. And so Aristotle is intentionally making these words, is presenting them almost poetically like this, but as a philosophical device more than anything. Translation and tradition. A long stretch of centuries stands between Aristotle and us. The usual translations of his writings stand as the end product of all the history that befell them in those centuries. For about 5 centuries up to 1600, they were the source of the dominant teachings of the European universities. For about 4 centuries since then, they have been reviled as the source of a rigid and empty dogmatism that stifled any genuine pursuit of knowledge. One has to be very learned, indeed, to uncover all that history. But fortunately for those of us who are interested only in understanding the writings themselves, no such historical background is of any use. In fact, it takes us far away from anything Aristotle wrote or meant. By chance, when Aristotle's books dominated the centers of European learning, the common language of higher learning was Latin. When in turn, later thinkers rebelled against the tyranny of the established schools, it was a Latinized version of Aristotle that they attacked. They wrote in the various modern European languages, but the words and phrases of Aristotle that they argued with about came into those languages with the smallest possible departures from the Latin. Thomas Hobbes, for example, writing in 1651, makes a common complaint in a memorable way. I believe that scarce anything can be more absurdly said in natural philosophy than that which is now called Aristotle's metaphysics. And since the authority of Aristotle is only current in the universities, that study is not properly philosophy. The nature whereof dependeth not on authors. So that was Hobbes' quote. The usual translations of Aristotle are concerned most of all with preserving a continuity of tradition back through these early modern critics of Aristotle. Richard McKeon, in a note to a philosophic glossary, defends this practice. The tendency recently in translations from Greek and Latin philosophers has been to seek out Anglo-Saxon terms and to avoid Latin derivatives. Words as clear and as definitely fixed in a long tradition of usage as privation, accident, and even substance have been replaced by barbarous compound terms which awaken no echo in the mind of one familiar with the tradition and afford no entrance into the tradition to one unfamiliar with it. In the translations above, an attempt has been made to return to the test of the English philosophers of the 17th century. Most of the Latin derivatives which are used have justification in the works of Hobbes, Kenelm, Digley, Cudworth, Culverwell, and even Bacon, and scores of writers contemporary with them. The mass of commentary on Aristotle will be rendered more difficult, if not impossible, of understanding it if the terms of the discussion are changed arbitrarily after 2,000 years. The tendency deplored by McKeon has not made its way into any translations of the writings of Aristotle known to this writer. There was some hope of it when Hippocrates, apostle, announcing a new series of translations, included the following among its principles. Quote, the terms should be familiar, that is, commonly used and with their usual meanings. If such terms are available, the use of strange terms, whether in English or in some other language, adds nothing scientific to the translation, but unnecessarily strains the reader's thought and often clouds or misleads it, end quote. The sentiment is worth endorsing, but Apostle respects it only to the minor extent of avoiding such pretentious phrases as ceteris paribus, Latin for, quote, other things being equal, end quote. And nothing in his translations would disturb McKeon. But if Apostle's general claim is correct, and if, in addition, Aristotle himself never used technical jargon, then surely to use such language to translate him is to confuse Aristotle's writing with a tradition that adapted them to purposes that were not his. And if the Latin tradition distorted Aristotle's meaning and was untrue to his philosophic spirit, until all that remained was the straw man so easily ridiculed by Hobbes and every other lively thinker of his time, then to insist on keeping Aristotle within the confines of that caricature is perverse. No text can be translated from one language to another with complete accuracy, and an author who takes liberties with common usage in his or her own language is especially difficult to translate. In this case, there is one simple rule that is easy to follow and always tends in a good direction. Avoid all of the conventional technical words that have been routinely used for Aristotle's central vocabulary. In fact, virtually all of those words are poor translations of the Greek they mean to stand for. The word privation, for instance, is not found in this translation for the simple reason that its meaning cannot be expected to be known to all the educated readers of English. Commentaries on Aristotle use the word extensively, but if the Greek word it refers to has been adequately translated in the first place, you will not need commentaries to tell you what it means. Here, that Greek word is translated sometimes as deprivation, sometimes as lack, according as one or the other fits more comfortably into its context. What matters is not whether Latin or Anglo-Saxon derivatives are used, but whether an understandable English word translates an understandable Greek one. Accident is a perfectly good English word, but not in the sense in which it appears in commentaries on Aristotle. The Greek word it replaces has a broad sense that corresponds to our word attribute, and a narrower one that can be conveyed by the phrase, where Aristotle used the simplest possible language in a way that keeps the focus off the words and on the things meant by them. I'm going to have to stop it right there, or I guess I can take this mobile here, which I didn't want to do, but just forgive me here for 1 second. All right. So basically the point here is Joseph Owens records the way this word became established in the tradition. It is a comedy of errors in which Christian scruples were imposed upon a non-biblical theology, and a disagreement with Aristotle was read back into his words as a translation of them. Classic Christian move. So just to clarify what that is there, the Christian scruples, like criticism of Aristotle by Christians, were imposed upon a non-biblical theology, and because of that, when they translated them, their inherent disagreement with Aristotle was baked into their words while they were translating. This translator ignores the contortions of the tradition and without apology uses the barbarous Anglo-Saxon compound thinghood. That's where, okay, we'll get into that, thinghood. Though it occurs only a few times in the Physics, the book, it is a central notion in the metaphysics and in all Aristotle's thought, and the word substance does nothing but obscure its meaning. Lively arguments about substance go on today in the secondary literature, but a choice must be made, and the primary texts of Aristotle are clearer, richer, deeper, easier to absorb, and more worth pursuing than the commentaries on them. As it stands in the usual translations, the word substance is little more than an unknown X for which meaning has to be deduced by a kind of algebra, while Aristotle shows that just asking what the thinghood of things consists in and what is responsible for it unlocks the highest inquiry of which philosophy is capable. For the promise of such a return, it is worth risking a little barbarity. The barbarism of a word like thinghood is just the fact that it falls far outside common usage in our language, and not in a direction that needs any historical or technical special knowledge to capture it, but in one that invites the same flexibility that poets ask of us. We cannot read such a word passively, but must take responsibility for its meaning. This in itself, in moderation and in well-judged places, is something good and is an imitation of what Aristotle does with Greek. That is huge to understand. So, right, the common criticism of the 16th century intellectuals was this barbaric language that Aristotle used. And the idea that it's barbaric is only because it falls outside of our common usage and language. And it's done intentionally to invite the listener or the reader. It forces them to understand the meaning of it, to inquire what they're actually saying. And it's a strategically placed. It's like a poet playing with words to express meaning. So it has already been remarked that the present translation does not always use the same English word for the same Greek one. This is partly because no English word has ever has the same full range of meaning as any Greek word, so that such a range has to be conveyed or unwanted connotations suppressed by the use of a variety of near synonyms. It is partly because a Greek word may have two or more distinct uses that differ according to context. In this way, the word for thinghood will often be translated as an independent thing. It is also partly because Aristotle always paid attention to the fact that important words are meant in more than one way. Let me say that again. Important words are meant in more than one way. For him, that was not a fault of language, but one of the ways in which it is truthful. A word often has a primary meaning and a variety of derivative ones. A word often has a primary meaning and a variety of derivative ones, as a reflection of causal relations in the world. The array of difference within the sameness usually cannot be lifted over from Greek to English and has to be gotten at indirectly. For example, in the physics, every kind of change is spoken of as a motion, though the word for motion is gradually and successively limited until it refers strictly only to change of place. This progression determines the main structure of the inquiry, but in English, the path would not be as clearly indicated by transitions of meaning within a single word. Finally, some words have many translations that are equally good in their different ways. In such cases, this translation rejoices in variety. This again is an imitation of Aristotle's general practice, where the traditional translations are marked by rigid, formulaic repetitions. Aristotle loves to combine overlapping meanings or separate intertwined meanings to point to things his language had no precise word for. It is the living, natural, flexible character of thinking that breathes through Aristotle's use of language, and not the artificial, machine-like fixity one finds in the translation. And that's where I will leave off on the translations, and I'm going to stop with this video. And we're just getting through a part of the introduction, but that was a critical piece of everything that I want to talk about when I go and put this all together. And just to hammer home that very last piece, This was something that I learned in school, and for some reason it stuck with me, and maybe it's been my success. It's why I've had success in understanding philosophy and why I've enjoyed it so much. But the Greek language, and this goes back to the linguistics argument here, will be part of that thread. In ancient languages, particularly Greek, Roman, Latin, like their language was way more nuanced than ours. There's a reason why people think that it's challenging to understand, right? And as it was mentioned in what I just read, a Greek word can have multiple different meanings depending on context. And there are words where it's like 7 different, I think the word love has like 7 different meanings depending on context. And that's one where I think, I can help people understand that, because that also exists a little bit today. And it's kind of like what slang does and the evolution of language over time, right? And, like the idea, memes are a great example of this, and like 6, 7, right? That conveys meaning, 6, 7, that's just 2 numbers, but like the way it means in our context today, it takes on a different meaning. So it's not hard to grasp that idea, but it's important to know that like in Greek, which Aristotle was writing in, these words had, there's a lot of the language used had multiple, definitions depending on context, and they don't translate to English perfectly. And so it's like, the point of all of this is to say, we're using these weird words, and it's not just to be annoying about it. It's because it's the best way to convey precisely what he was trying to capture because of our shortcoming in translation. And again, so I got to find a better way of like one sentence or one paragraph to express exactly what that means. But right, and on the dogma front too, right? Like the dogma front is Aristotle was using barbaric language. It doesn't make any sense. It's nonsensical, but also it's not scientific. So it's like twofold. Like to battle that dogma, like we have to like go back to place yourself in that position and just understand this context here. And hopefully it'll become clear why this translation matters. And doing it like this matters, but it also speaks to, right, and underlying this, and I think this will be good, it speaks to the way Aristotle thought. It's that sort of poetic, intentional use of obscure, like distortions of words or language, right, to strategically emphasize or place meaning or draw attention, while also requiring the reader or the listener to become responsible for the meaning of that thing, right? And so it's my job now as the sort of middleman here to help people place the appropriate meaning on those things by placing it in a modern context. I think that's a piece of it. But yeah, so all of that is just the language piece. I specifically wanted to spend a good chunk of time talking about this because it is critical to the argument here. It's going to take me a while to get through the introduction because I'm going to do it this way. But I think that's exactly what I needed, and I'm happy with how this has gone so far.